The city of Chicago in November was not merely cold, it was hostile. The wind whipped off the lake like a physical blow, cutting through wool and denim with equal indifference, turning the streets into canyons of gray ice. But nowhere was the wind colder, or the shadows longer, than at the base of the Caldwell Tower. It was a monolith of obsidian glass and steel that pierced the low-hanging clouds, a monument to unyielding ambition. It was a place where fortunes were made in microseconds, and where mercy was considered a rounding error. At the foot of this titan, near the grate of the subway ventilation where a ghost of warmth occasionally rose, stood Aurora. She was an anomaly in this landscape of concrete and rushing suits. Dressed in a coat that had seen too many winters, with fraying cuffs and a hem damp from the slush, she looked like a leaf blown off a dying tree. But her posture was rigid, defiant. Tucked under her chin was a violin, not a masterpiece, but a well-cared-for instrument that gleamed with the polish of daily devotion. She wasn't begging. Her case was open at her feet. Yes, but she never looked down to see if anyone dropped a coin. Her eyes were closed, her lashes catching the snowflakes as she played. She played Vivaldi in the middle of a blizzard. The notes were sharp, frantic, and achingly beautiful, cutting through the roar of traffic and the hiss of the wind. To the thousands of commuters rushing past, she was just part of the urban noise, background static to be ignored. They saw the worn boots, they didn't hear the perfect pitch. They saw the poverty, they didn't see the artist. True dignity is not shouted, it is a quiet endurance that outlasts the storm. Aurora played because if she stopped, the cold would claim her fingers, and without her hands, she was nothing. She was 24, alone in a city that devoured the solitary, carrying the weight of a dream that had slowly turned into a survival instinct. She had once been promised stages and spotlights, but life, cruel, expensive, and unpredictable, had stripped away the scholarships and the safety nets, leaving her with nothing but the music and the pavement. High above her, on the 50th floor, Oliver Caldwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office. The city below looked like a circuit board, a grid of lights he controlled. At 32, Oliver was the youngest titan in the city's history. He had the kind of face that graced business magazines, sharp jaw, brooding dark eyes, hair perfectly coiffed, but in person there was a hollowness to him. He was a man who had conquered the mountain only to realize the air at the summit was too thin to breathe. He was leaving the building late, surrounded by a phalanx of security and assistants murmuring schedules into headsets. As the automatic doors slid open, the biting wind hit him, but so did something else. The music. It was a thread of silver in the gray noise. Oliver stopped. His security detail halted instantly, confused. He waved them back. He walked toward the source of the sound, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the salted pavement. He saw her then, a slip of a woman, shivering violently, her fingers moving with a desperate, beautiful speed. He didn't know Vivaldi from a pop song, but he knew misery. He saw the red, chapped skin of her hands. He saw the emptiness of the violin case. He felt a pang in his chest, a rare foreign sensation. Pity. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling. He looked at her and saw a broken thing that needed fixing, a stray animal shivering in his doorway. He stepped into her line of sight. Aurora opened her eyes. They were a striking, stormy gray, wide with surprise but devoid of fear. She stopped playing, the bow hovering over the strings. "You're freezing," Oliver said. His voice was deep, authoritative, the voice of a man used to stating facts. not asking questions. "I'm playing," Aurora corrected him, her voice raspy from the cold but steady. She lowered the violin, tucking it protectively against her coat. Oliver reached into his tailored cashmere coat. He didn't pull out a wallet to drop a $20 bill, which would have been charity. He pulled out a business card. To him, this was a greater kindness. He was offering a solution to a problem he had diagnosed in 3 seconds: poverty. "My archival department is in the basement. It's warm, it's quiet, and it pays a living wage," Oliver said, extending the card. He looked at her with a soft, condescending kindness, the look one gives a child who has scraped their knee. No one should have to perform for their supper in the snow. "It's undignified." Aurora stared at the card. Undignified. The word stung more than the wind. He didn't hear the art. He only saw the struggle. He thought he was saving her from the music, not realizing the music was the only thing saving her. But then, a gust of wind nearly knocked her over, and her stomach gave a painful, empty twist. Pride was a luxury. Starvation was a reality. She took the card. Her rough, cold fingers brushed against his warm, manicured hand. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that made Oliver pull back slightly, startled by the intensity of her gaze. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Caldwell," Aurora said, reading the name on the card. "But I do need the heat." "Be there at 8," Oliver replied, turning away, already checking his watch, satisfied with his good deed. He had fixed the broken thing. He had moved the piece on the board. He walked to his waiting limousine, unaware that he hadn't just hired a file clerk. He had invited a storm into his sterile, controlled world. As the car pulled away, Aurora remained on the corner, clutching the card like a lifeline that felt suspiciously like a shackle. She packed her violin away, the click of the case sounding like a door locking shut. She would enter his tower, she would take his money, but she promised herself one thing under the dark Chicago sky. He would never, ever own her music. The stage was set for a collision between a man who thought he could buy peace and a woman who knew that some things are priceless. The basement of Caldwell Tower was not designed for humans. It was designed for secrets. It was a subterranean labyrinth of metal shelves and fluorescent lights that hummed with the monotonous frequency of a headache. The air here was recycled, dry, and tasted faintly of ozone and forgotten decisions. For 2 weeks, Aurora had existed in this windowless purgatory, filing decades of financial reports, her violinist's fingers now stained with ink and gray dust. She worked with a terrifying efficiency. To her, the stacks of paper were just another complex score to be memorized and executed. She didn't complain. She didn't speak to the few other clerks who shuffled past like zombies. She simply did the work, collected her paycheck, and vanished the moment the clock struck 5. She was a ghost in the machine, grateful for the warmth, but determined not to let the machine swallow her soul. Silence is the loudest sound in a room full of noise. 50 floors above, Oliver Caldwell was finding it impossible to focus. The city lay spread out before him like a conquered kingdom, yet his mind kept drifting to the basement. He told himself it was simple managerial curiosity. He had done a good deed. He wanted to ensure his investment was sound. But deep down, a jagged splinter of unease pricked at him. He remembered her eyes, stormy, gray, and devoid of the gratitude he was accustomed to purchasing. He descended. The elevator ride down was a slow transition from the rarefied air of the gods to the stagnant air of the mortals. When the door slid open, Oliver stepped into the archives, his presence instantly sucking the oxygen out of the room. The other clerks froze, staring at the CEO as if a wolf had walked into a sheep pen. Oliver ignored them. He walked straight to the back, to the furthest aisle, where he found her. Aurora was standing on a rolling ladder, reaching for a file on the top shelf. She didn't startle when he approached. She simply pulled the file, tucked it under her arm, and looked down. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was cool, polite, and completely empty of awe. "Aurora," Oliver replied, the name feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. He looked at her worn sweater, noticing how the harsh lighting washed her out, making her look fragile. The pity flared again, a comfortable, familiar feeling. "I trust the work is suitable. It's not too taxing." Aurora climbed down the ladder, her movements graceful and precise. She placed the file on a cart. "It is alphabetizing, sir. It requires eyes, not a soul. I am managing." "You could have asked for a heater," Oliver noted, seeing her rub her hands together, those precious red-knuckled hands. "I can have one sent down." "The temperature is fine," Aurora countered, turning to face him fully. The distance between them was less than 3 feet, a violation of the corporate caste system. "And I prefer not to ask for things I cannot return." There it was again, the defiance. It irritated him, yet he couldn't look away. In a world of yes men, her no was intoxicating. He looked at her hands, imagining them on the violin, imagining the passion he had glimpsed on the street corner. Here, surrounded by dead paper, she seemed like a trapped bird. "I am trying to help you," Oliver said, his voice dropping, the frustration leaking through. "Why do you make it feel like an insult?" "Because you didn't hire me for my skills, Mr. Caldwell," Aurora said soft, her gaze piercing his armor. "You hired me to make yourself feel better about walking past me. You hired a mirror, not an employee." The truth hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Oliver stepped closer, compelled by a force he couldn't name. He could smell her scent, soap, old paper, and the faint, sweet smell of rosin. It was real. It was grounding. For a second, he forgot the merger waiting on his desk. He forgot the fiancée, Eleanor, who was currently choosing floral arrangements for a charity gala he dreaded. He only saw the gray of Aurora's eyes. We hate the truth only when it reflects what we fear to see. He reached out, almost involuntarily, to brush a smudge of dust from her shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership, of familiarity. Aurora didn't flinch, but she stiffened. The micro-tension was electric. His hand hovered, then dropped. The gap between the billionaire and the file clerk was invisible, but it was charged with a dangerous current. "I need these files organized by date for the gala preparations," Oliver said, retreating into business, his voice rough. "Do not be late." He turned and left, his heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with business. But the real shift happened 3 nights later. It was nearly midnight. Oliver was still in the building, avoiding going home to his empty, sterile penthouse. The tower was silent, a sleeping giant. He was walking toward the private elevator when he heard it. A melody, faint, ghostly, rising through the ventilation shafts. It wasn't the radio. It was live. It was raw. Oliver didn't leave. He followed the sound. It led him not to the basement, but to the uncompleted 40th floor, a raw space of concrete and girders that had been abandoned during construction. He pushed open the heavy fire door. There she was. Aurora stood by the open edge of the unfinished floor, where the glass wall hadn't yet been installed, protected only by a temporary railing. The wind whipped her hair across her face, swirling around her like a lover. She was playing the violin. But this wasn't the frantic Vivaldi of the street corner. This was something slow, mournful, and achingly tender. She swayed with the music, her eyes closed, her face transformed by a rapture that Oliver had never felt in his entire life. She looked wild. She looked free. She looked like a queen standing in the wreckage of his tower. He watched from the shadows, paralyzed. The pity that had defined his view of her evaporated instantly, replaced by a hollow ache in his own chest. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he wasn't the one saving her. She had something he could never buy. She had a fire that burned without fuel. She ended the piece on a high, trembling note that seemed to hang in the cold air forever. When she lowered the bow, she didn't turn around, but she spoke. "Are you going to fire me for trespassing, Mr. Caldwell?" She knew he was there. She had felt him. Oliver stepped out of the shadows. The wind tugged at his tie. He looked at the woman he had tried to reduce to a charity case, and he realized he was looking at the most dangerous thing in his world. "No," Oliver whispered, the word lost to the wind. "I'm not going to fire you." He walked to the edge, standing beside her, looking out at the city lights that suddenly seemed dim compared to the woman beside him. The barrier of class, of employer and employee, felt paper-thin against the sheer force of the moment. "I need you upstairs," Oliver said, the decision bypassing his logic entirely. "My personal assistant just resigned. I need someone organized. Someone discreet." It was a lie. He didn't need an assistant. He needed to be near the fire. Aurora turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the shift. She saw the danger. Accepting this meant stepping out of the shadows and into the blinding light of his world, a world that would judge her, mock her, and eventually discard her. "I am a violinist, Oliver," she said, using his first name, a quiet rebellion. "Not a secretary." "Be both," he challenged, his gaze intense, stripping away her defenses. "But do it on the 50th floor." The offer hung between them, a promotion that felt like a seduction, a step up that was actually a fall into the abyss. Aurora looked at her violin, then at the man who was looking at her as if she were the only star in a dark sky. She knew she should run, but the cold was biting, and his eyes were warm. Life on the 50th floor was a seduction of comfort. For 3 weeks, Aurora existed in the orbit of Oliver Caldwell, a world of hushed carpets, espresso served in bone china, and a view that made the city look like a toy set. She was efficient, silent, and indispensable. But beneath the surface of schedules and spreadsheets, a different language was being spoken. It was in the way Oliver's hand lingered on the back of her chair when he reviewed a document. It was in the way the silence between them during late-night work sessions felt heavier, charged with the static of things they were too afraid to name. He was no longer looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a hunger that terrified him. And Aurora, who had spent years building walls of ice to survive the streets, felt them melting under the heat of his gaze. She began to forget the cold pavement. She began to believe, foolishly, dangerously, that she could belong in the sky. The higher you climb, the fatal the fall. The illusion shattered on the night of the Caldwell Foundation Gala. It was the social event of the season, a gathering of sharks in silk and predators in pearls. Aurora was not invited as a guest. She was there to manage the silent auction, standing in the shadows of the ballroom, dressed in a simple black dress Oliver had quietly purchased for her. She looked stunning, a stark, elegant contrast to the gaudy display of wealth around her. Oliver moved through the crowd, a king in his element, but his eyes kept darting back to the corner where she stood. He looked restless, trapped by the endless handshakes and hollow compliments. At his side, linking her arm through his with the grip of a vice, was Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman made of diamonds and razor blades. She had sensed the shift in Oliver weeks ago. She had smelled the change in him, the distraction, the softness. And tonight, watching his gaze wander to the help for the 10th time, she decided to mark her territory. The orchestra stopped playing. The murmur of the crowd died down as Oliver took the stage to give his speech. He looked commanding, the perfect philanthropist. He spoke of duty, of giving back, of the city's responsibility to its forgotten souls. And then he made a mistake. A terrible, well-intentioned, catastrophic mistake. He looked directly at Aurora. "Tonight," Oliver said, his voice booming through the speakers, "I am reminded that talent can bloom in the harshest winters. We have someone with us tonight who reminds me that charity is not just about writing checks, but about opening doors. Aurora, please." He gestured for her to come forward. The spotlight swung through the darkness, blinding her, pinning her against the wall like a specimen. Aurora froze. This wasn't part of the plan. She felt the blood drain from her face as hundreds of eyes turned to dissect her. She walked onto the stage, her legs trembling. She thought he was going to introduce her as his assistant. She thought he was going to give her dignity. Instead, Oliver smiled, a benevolent, savior smile. "I found Aurora playing violin on a street corner just a month ago, freezing in the snow," he announced to the room, thinking he was telling a heartwarming story of redemption. "Tonight, I am proud to announce the Caldwell Scholarship for the Arts, and Aurora will be its first recipient. We're going to make sure she never has to beg for an audience again." The room erupted in polite applause. The guests cooed, touched by the billionaire's generosity. "How noble," they whispered. "How kind of him to save the little street girl." But inside Aurora, something vital snapped. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't seen the artist who played Vivaldi to the wind. He had only seen the beggar. He had brought her up here not to stand beside him, but to be his trophy of goodness. He had taken her pride, the one thing she had fought to keep on that street corner, and auctioned it off for applause. Pity is a poison that tastes like sugar until it swallows you whole. She stood there, the check he tried to hand her feeling like burning coal. She looked at him, and for the first time, Oliver saw the devastation in her eyes. He saw his mistake. He saw the thank you die on her lips and be replaced by a look of absolute betrayal. But the final blow was yet to come. Eleanor stepped up to the microphone, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, Oliver, you are too modest," Eleanor purred, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "And since we have the little fiddler here, why doesn't she play for her supper? Surely, after such a generous gift, she owes us a song. Play something lively, dear. Entertain us." It was a command, not a request. It reduced her to a court jester, a dancing monkey. Oliver stepped forward, his face pale. "Eleanor, that's not necessary." "I'll play," Aurora said. Her voice was quiet, but it silenced the room instantly. She didn't have her violin. She walked to the string quartet hired for the evening, and without a word, borrowed the instrument from the stunned first chair. She walked back to the center of the stage, alone in the spotlight. She didn't play something lively. She didn't play a waltz for the rich to spin to. She played a dissonance. She played a piece of raw, screaming improvisation that sounded like winter wind tearing through a hollow building. It was ugly. It was magnificent. It was a musical scream of rage and sorrow. It made the guests uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats, the champagne turning sour in their mouths. She poured her entire broken heart into the strings, forcing them to hear the pain they usually pay to ignore. She played until a string snapped with a loud, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. Aurora handed the violin back. She didn't look at the crowd. She turned to Oliver. He was standing motionless, stripped of his composure, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time, not as a charity case, but as a woman he had profoundly failed. "You can keep the scholarship, Mr. Caldwell," Aurora whispered, her voice amplified by the microphone, carrying to every corner of the room. "I told you on the street I needed heat. I didn't need you to buy my soul." She took the check he was still holding, tore it slowly in half, and let the pieces fall to the polished stage floor. Then she turned and walked away. "Aurora, wait!" Oliver called out, ignoring the gasp of the crowd, ignoring Eleanor's hand clutching his arm. But she didn't stop. She walked off the stage, through the parting sea of stunned socialites, and out the heavy double doors. She walked out of the gala, out of the tower, and back into the cold, dark city night. She had nothing in her pockets. She had no job, but as the wind hit her face, drying the tears she refused to shed, she felt lighter. The fall from the 50th floor was terrifying, but at least on the ground, the air was hers to breathe. The separation was absolute, leaving Oliver standing on a stage of gold, realizing he was the poorest man in the room. The applause at the gala had long faded, replaced by the nervous murmurs of a social elite that had just witnessed the impossible. Oliver Caldwell, the untouchable architect of the city skyline, standing alone on a stage littered with torn paper. Eleanor was furious, her voice a shrill siren in the dressing room, listing the PR disasters and the headlines that would run by morning. But Oliver didn't hear her. The silence inside him was deafening. The image of Aurora walking away, her back straight, her dignity intact, her silhouette cutting through the crowd like a blade, played on a loop in his mind. He realized then that he hadn't been building a legacy. He had been building a mausoleum. He walked out of the ballroom, ignoring Eleanor's shrieks, ignoring his security detail. He took the service elevator down, stripping off his tuxedo jacket and loosening the tie that felt like a noose. He walked out into the freezing Chicago night, the wind hitting him with the force of a judgment. He didn't take the limousine. He walked. He walked blindly, guided by a magnetic pull toward the only place that felt real. He found her exactly where they had started, near the subway ventilation grate at the base of his tower. Aurora wasn't playing. The violin was packed away in its case, sitting on the wet concrete. She was sitting on a rusted bench, her knees pulled to her chest, shivering not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash of her rebellion. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, heavy, expensive shoes scuffing against the grit. She didn't stand. She didn't run. She looked at him with eyes that were tired of fighting. "You came to get your check back?" Aurora asked, her voice hoarse. "Or to fire me formally?" "I came to apologize," Oliver said. He stood in the slush, the wind ruining his perfect hair, looking nothing like the Titan on the magazine covers. "But I know that word isn't enough." "You humiliated me, Oliver," Aurora said, standing up slowly. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound disappointment that hurt him more than rage. You turned my life into a spectacle. You didn't see a musician tonight. You saw a pet project, a way to show the world how benevolent the great Oliver Caldwell is. I thought I was helping, Oliver pleaded, the desperation leaking into his voice. I wanted to give you a platform. I wanted to give you safety. I never asked for safety, Aurora shouted, her voice cracking. I asked for heat. I asked for a job. You tried to buy the one thing I own that isn't for sale. My music is my voice, Oliver. It's not your charity tax write-off. She picked up her case, turning to leave. Go back to your tower. You don't belong down here. My sister was a cellist. The confession tore out of Oliver's throat, raw and jagged. It stopped Aurora in her tracks. She turned around, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Oliver was trembling, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The armor was gone. The CEO was dead. The man who remained was bleeding. Her name was Clara, Oliver whispered, stepping into the dim light of a street lamp. She was brilliant, like you. She felt everything too deeply. She played like the world was ending. He took a shaky breath, the secret he had guarded for a decade finally spilling onto the pavement. My parents, they didn't understand. They cut her off. They told her to grow up, to get a real job. And I was the golden boy, the success story. I sided with them. Aurora watched him, her grip on the violin case loosening. She saw the ghost haunting his eyes, the same hollowness she had seen in the mirror during her darkest nights. I told her to be practical, Oliver continued, tears mixing with the sleet on his face. I told her I wouldn't support her hobby. I thought I was teaching her responsibility. I thought I was saving her from a hard life. He looked up at Aurora, his eyes black with grief. She died in a cold apartment 3 miles from here, Aurora. An overdose. She was 22. I had billions of dollars, and I couldn't save her because I was too busy trying to fix her. The truth hung between them, heavy and absolute. The puzzle of Oliver Caldwell finally clicked into place. His pity wasn't arrogance, it was penance. He hadn't been trying to save Aurora from the street. He had been trying to save Clara from the grave. He was a man running a marathon against his own guilt, trying to buy redemption with scholarships and job offers. We try to fix in others what we broke in ourselves. Aurora's expression softened. The wall of ice between them melted, not from heat, but from the salt of shared pain. She understood now. He wasn't a monster. He was a brother who had failed, terrified of failing again. She took a step toward him. "You looked at me," she said softly, "and you saw a ghost." "I saw a second chance," Oliver admitted, his voice breaking. "And I destroyed it because I don't know how to love anything without trying to control it." He looked at her, defeated. "I don't want you to be my charity case, Aurora. I don't want you to be my assistant. I can't walk past the music again. I can't let it fade out." This was the crossroads. He had laid his soul bare on the dirty concrete. He had handed her the weapon to destroy him, but instead, she felt a profound, aching connection. They were both survivors of a world that demanded they be something they weren't. Him a statue, her a statistic. Aurora didn't walk away. She placed her violin case down gently. She walked up to him, closing the distance until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She didn't offer forgiveness, which was cheap. She offered understanding, which was expensive. "You can't save me, Oliver," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I saved myself a long time ago. But—" She hesitated, then reached out, her rough, calloused hand taking his cold, manicured one. "You can listen, not as a CEO, not as a brother trying to rewrite the past, just as you." Oliver looked at their joined hands. The connection was grounding, an anchor in the storm. He squeezed her hand, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a universe of liquid assets. "I'm listening," he whispered. "I'm finally listening." The reconciliation had begun, not with a check or a grand gesture, but with a confession in the snow. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer the savior, and she was no longer the victim. They were just two broken instruments trying to find a harmony in the noise of the city. But the path ahead was steep. Oliver had to dismantle the life he had built to protect himself, and Aurora had to trust the man who had publicly broken her. There was hope, yes, a small, flickering flame in the winter wind, but it would take more than words to keep it burning. It would take the courage to face the music together. The night on the street corner did not end with a kiss, nor did it end with a grand, sweeping declaration that erased the past. It ended with a quiet agreement, a treaty signed in the invisible ink of shared understanding. Oliver walked Aurora to the subway station, not as a guardian protecting a ward, but as a man escorting an equal. He didn't offer to pay her fare. He didn't force his coat upon her. He simply walked beside her, matching his stride to hers, allowing the silence between them to be comfortable rather than filled with the noise of his guilt. The next morning, the Caldwell Tower looked the same to the passing world, a monolith of glass scratching the sky, but inside, the foundation had shifted. Oliver walked into his office, the scene of his absolute control, and felt like a stranger in his own life. He looked at the empty chair where Aurora used to sit, filing papers that meant nothing. He called Eleanor. The conversation was brief, clinical, and final. There was no shouting, only the cold snap of a connection being severed. He realized he could no longer live in a world decorated by people who only loved the reflection in the mirror. Then, Oliver did the hardest thing he had ever done. He stepped back. He restructured the Caldwell Scholarship. He removed his name from the title. He removed the gala requirements, the photo ops, and the humiliating gratitude speeches. He turned it into a blind grant, awarded solely on the merit of recorded auditions, judged by musicians, not socialites. He dismantled the stage he had built for his own ego and replaced it with a ladder for others to climb on their own strength. True dignity is not shouted. It is a quiet endurance that outlasts the storm. Aurora, meanwhile, did not return to the basement, and she did not return to the street corner. The confrontation at the gala had broken something in her, but it wasn't her spirit, it was her fear. She had stood in front of the city's elite and screamed her truth with a violin. After that, the rejection of an audition panel seemed trivial. She practiced. She played until her fingers bled and calloused over, harder than before. She auditioned for the Chicago Symphony's open chair, not as the charity case Oliver had tried to manufacture, but as Aurora, the artist who had survived the winter. She played Vivaldi again, but this time the notes weren't shivering, they were burning. She won the seat not because of a billionaire's pity, but because she was undeniable. Months bled into spring. The ice on the lake melted, and the gray city began to breathe in color. The night of her debut concert, the concert hall was packed. The air smelled of expensive perfume in anticipation. Aurora sat on stage, surrounded by the swell of the orchestra, her violin tucked under her chin. She was wearing a dress she had bought with her own paycheck, a deep, midnight blue that shimmered under the stage lights. She felt small yet infinite. As the conductor raised his baton, Aurora allowed her gaze to drift, just for a second, to the audience. She didn't look at the private boxes, the gilded cages where the wealthy sat to be seen. She looked at the stalls, the general seating where the true listeners sat. And there he was. Oliver sat in row G, seat 12. He wasn't surrounded by security. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a simple dark suit, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on her with a laser focus. He hadn't sent flowers backstage. He hadn't tried to buy a VIP pass. He had bought a ticket, just like everyone else. He had kept his promise. He was listening. The music began. It was a symphony of resurrection, a swelling tide of sound that washed over the hall. Aurora played her part, weaving her sound into the collective tapestry. She wasn't a soloist demanding attention. She was a vital thread in a larger design. But every time her bow touched the strings, she felt a tether connecting her to the man in row G. She played for the girl who froze on the corner. She played for Clara, the ghost who haunted him. And she played for Oliver, the man who had to break his own heart to find it. When the final movement crashed to a halt and the applause erupted like a sudden storm, Oliver didn't stand immediately. He sat still in the roaring crowd, watching her. He saw the flush on her cheeks, the light in her eyes. A light he hadn't purchased, a light he didn't own. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They met afterwards by the stage door. The alley was cool, reminding them of the night they met, but the biting hostility of winter was gone. "You were good," Oliver said. It was a simple sentence, stripped of all the flowery, corporate language he used to hide behind. "I was loud." Aurora smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "And I was free." "I heard you," Oliver replied. He reached into his pocket, but this time he didn't pull out a business card or a check. He pulled out his hand, empty and open. "I'm not the CEO tonight, Aurora. I'm just Oliver. I'm just the man who needed to learn the difference between saving someone and seeing them." Aurora looked at his hand. She remembered the touch of it when he offered her a job out of pity. She remembered the touch of it when he tried to hand her the check on stage. But now it was just a hand that had let go of control to make room for something real. She placed her hand in his. The calluses on her fingertips grazed his palm, a reminder of the work, the struggle, and the art that bridged the gap between their worlds. "Hello, Oliver," she whispered. Oliver looked at her, his eyes shining with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. "Clara would have loved it," he said, his voice thick. "She would have loved seeing you fly." Aurora squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgment of the ghosts they were finally putting to rest. "I know a place a few blocks from here," Oliver continued, a small, genuine smile breaking through. "Terrible coffee, excellent pie. Can I take you? Not as a donor, just as a man who wants to know who you are when you're not playing Vivaldi." Aurora smiled back, the expression reaching her eyes. "I'd like that, Oliver." He didn't hire her. He didn't save her. He simply walked beside her as they turned toward the city lights. They walked past the Caldwell Tower, which loomed high above them, a monument to power. But down here on the street level, amidst the noise of traffic and the rhythm of the city, they had found something taller than any skyscraper. They had found a love that didn't ask for a receipt. Oliver realized that for years he had been trying to conduct the world, controlling every tempo and every note. But falling for Aurora had taught him the most important lesson of all. The most profound music isn't found in the notes you force into existence, but in the silence you share with the one person who understands your song. He had hired her to fix a silence he couldn't bear, but in the end, she taught him that the only way to heal is to listen to the music of a soul that needs nothing from you but your heart. And in the quiet of that Chicago night, for the first time in his life, Oliver Caldwell was finally playing in tune.